I will just say before I, well, it is a bit odd to introduce myself. Before I launch into this, students, I'm sorry, no PowerPoints, no bells and whistles, very old school today. I'm a 20th century personality. In my classes, I actually attempt to enter this millennium with some success, mixed success. I want to say that this whole JuSt series, which has been running at least 20 years, started off as a more or less a brown bag for people to present research in progress rather than completed projects. That hasn't always been the case as we've evolved, but today I'm definitely biting off more than I should reasonably chew. So it's not going to be a terribly long talk, 35, 40 minutes max, but then please feel free to comment, criticize, suggest. I have my pen right here. That's how 20th century I am. And so I'm looking forward to getting your suggestions. So I think I'll start. And there should be a handout with some of the quotes and some of the bibliography on the back that I rely on. In the mid-1980s, Mark Knoll, a scholar of American religion, wrote, quote, "On the face of it, it would be hard to imagine a nation more thoroughly biblical than the United States between the American Revolution and the Civil War." Knoll's sentence contains both an academic agenda and an implicit invitation. This academic agenda has been carried out extensively. No longer can we agree to Perry Miller's observation that, quote, "The Old Testament is truly so omnipresent in the American culture of 1800 or 1820 that historians have as much difficulty taking cognizance of it as the air people breathe. A generation of able scholars have taken cognizance, demonstrating the influence of the Bible on the American founding, forever complicating a straightforward secularist narrative. In the late 1980s, political scientist Donald Lutz sought out the founders' favorite philosopher and found a 7th century BCE author known as the Deuteronomist. Extending this statistical analysis to sermons, we now know that the Bible played a ubiquitous and martial role in the Revolutionary War. Colonial literacy meant, above all, biblical literacy, an equation for anyone familiar with the role of the Bible in post-Enlightenment Europe will find unsurprising. Artistically, the iconography of the founders provides a clear case of Hebraic content poured into Hellenic forms, complete with the sense to heaven and halos. Other scholars have analyzed the founders' favorite go-to passages. 50 times George Washington cited Micah 4 with its admonition to beat swords into plowshares and his promise that every citizen, even Jewish ones in Newport, Rhode Island, should sit beneath their vine and fig tree unafraid. Yes, just as Mark Knoll claimed, revolutionary America was thoroughly biblical. Everyone hear me okay? Knoll's implicit invitation, however, seems to have gone unnoticed. I would like to evaluate his assessment of American bibliomania via an obvious counterexample. The state of Israel in its formative decades, also an arguably biblical nation. My talk, really an invitation to some intrepid scholar somewhere to undertake a book-length treatment, and definitely not a request to teach a U.S. history survey, highlights 4 areas of comparison. First, the chronological parameters of the phenomenon. Second, the use of the Bible as a political model. Third, the recasting of the Bible as meta-narrative. And fourth, the Bible as cultural touchstone. After surveying this ground, I'll point to some obvious discontinuities between the two nations and finally justify why comparison along biblical lines is important. As an epitome of this biblical attitude, let us take the following 2 quotes, one from John Adams, one from Yitzhak Tebenkin, both founders of the First Rank, and you can find this on your handout. Adams stressed biblical laws, morals, piety, and efficacy. Suppose a nation in some distant region should take the Bible for their only law book, and every member should regulate his conduct by the precepts there exhibited. Every member would be obliged in conscience to temperance and frugality and industry, to justice and kindness and charity toward his fellow men, and to piety and love and reverence toward Almighty God. In this commonwealth, no man would impair his health by gluttony, drunkenness, or lust. No man would sacrifice his most precious time to cards or any other trifling and mean amusement. No man would steal or lie or in any way defraud his neighbor, but would live in peace and goodwill with all men. No man would blaspheme his maker or profane his worship. I guess John Adams studied in Germany at some point for sentences this long. But a rational and manly, sincere and unaffected piety and devotion would reign in all hearts. Yitzhak Tebenkin noted the worker-soldier ethos in the Bible's patent of legitimacy, much as David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, would tell the British in 1936, the Bible is our mandate. Quote, "We cannot speak about the spiritual world of the members of the Second Aliyah in Palestine without mentioning the special influence of the Bible. The Bible is the spiritual reflection of agricultural and military life, the image of a conquering people, a working people, a people of this world. The Bible served as a kind of birth certificate. It helped tear down the barrier between people and the land and nurtured a sense of homeland. All of this was expressed in the close touch maintained with this book and in the fact so unusual in a worker's environment that there was a copy of the Bible in nearly every worker's room." Brandon, Lindsay, I think there was...
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Lisa?
Sorry.
No, I think there were some seats back there, yes?
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
There's one. I'm simply trying to get a cup of tea.
Okay, good. Okay.
Okay.
Given the intense identification of the founders, American and Israeli, with the Bible, I must stress that neither nation, no modern nation, can be a biblical nation. Chronologically, America was founded at the height of the Enlightenment. It happens that 1776 was the year that both Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations and Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire were both published. The political language of 18th century republicanism and religious tolerance were far removed from anything found in the Hebrew Bible. By contrast, modern Israel was founded in the waning years of European colonialism. From 1945 to 1960, 17 African nations won their independence. India and Pakistan became separate countries divided largely on religio-ethnic lines, not unlike Israel and Jordanian-ruled Palestine before 1967. Another preliminary item needs mentioning: the changing status of the Bible. Although modern biblical criticism began in the Enlightenment, and many of the American founders were free from traditional orthodoxies, they were deeply religious. On Adams and Jefferson, historian Edwin Gostad wrote, quote, "One of the ironies regarding our two philosophes is that they repeatedly say that they will not talk about, will not discuss religion. They then proceed to talk about and discuss very little else," end quote. By 1948, the needle had moved considerably, and most of the Israeli founders were avowed secularists, though no less biblical. David Ben-Gurion thought the Bible an accurate historical record, at least by 21st century standards, but to the Israeli founders, the Bible was the product of Jewish genius, not of God. Consequently, when Ben-Gurion attempted to read Joshua 24, the covenant at Shechem, as a democratic text, a nation truly founded on the basis of a secular compact, that was a selective reading. We must regard as similarly anachronistic Ben-Gurion's purported confidence in the Bible's ability to solve class conflict internally and the Arab-Israeli conflict externally. If any ancient Near Eastern text held the key to synthetically resolving Marxian categories, that is nowhere in evidence. As a matter of foreign affairs, adducing the Bible has more often exacerbated matters than resolved them. But most disruptive to a simple equation of then and now, scholars largely agree that ancient Israel itself was not a biblical nation, for the Bible in its normative sense did not become the Bible until a much later period. Even Deuteronomy, the Bible book most cited by the founders of both nations, never served as an actual constitution of ancient Israel, though comes closest of any book to being an ideal constitution. To state the obvious, by biblical nation, I mean two nations, modern nations, that don the mantle of the Bible for the purpose of convincing others of their right to exist and themselves of the justness of their missions. For both nations, the Bible was the most admired text, the most cited text by Orthodox and unorthodox figures alike. My first point. There were only four. My first point, a chronological one, follows from the preceding observations. Since neither nation could be biblical, this myth had a definable lifespan. The newness of each nation compared to European counterparts played a part, inviting attraction to a remote past. Germans could point to the fierce warriors described by Tacitus. Sir Walter Scott celebrated the coming together of Norman and Saxon. The French confided that Charles Martel had saved Western civilization. All of these, by Jewish standards, qualify as current events. The Zionists were trying to skip back over a 2,000-year diaspora to a period of national sovereignty. Also a new nation, America had its own problematic version of a land without a people, extolling the boundless frontier while importing enslaved Africans and deporting Native Americans. Clearly, a closer examination would necessitate differentiating biblical usage in the colonial era from the early Republic, in pre-state Palestine from the establishment of the State of Israel. But the terminal points of this biblical self-perception seem politically limited and somewhat later than expected. By the 1830s and 1840s, Americans divided emphatically on the issue of slavery. While a literal reading of the Bible supported slavery, a liberal reading of the Bible opposed it. This led, before the Civil War, to a reemergence of the abolitionists' also selective reading of the New Testament Gospels against the putative endorsement of household slavery found in Exodus 21 and elsewhere. The eulogy to this facile view of the Bible was delivered in Lincoln's second inaugural, which used the stubborn fact that, quote, both sides read the same Bible and pray to the same God, end quote, as a nail driven into the coffin of religious self-righteousness. Regarding modern Israel, a consensus exists that the influence of the Bible, already significant in the 1920s and 30s and in rapid ascent in the 1950s and 60s, began to wane in the 1970s. Once again, it seems to me the difference between opposing politics holds the key. The rise of the religious nationalist right and their appeal to settle the whole land of Israel had the effect of secular and left-wing Israelis rejecting the literalism or even the applicability of biblical texts to contemporary realities. My conclusion in both cases is that as soon as real differences of opinion appeared, the limitations of applying the Bible as a policy guideline became apparent. The Bible had always served as a resource for support for opinions already arrived at, rather than an exegetical enterprise that drove new doctrines. One may speculate that for both nations, the Bible served the founding generations as a sort of crutch of national identity and authentication. Once these nations developed an actual identity, the need for a mythical one dissipated. Despite a comeback in secularist appropriations of the Bible in the last few decades in Israel, Anita Shapira's question remains unanswered. Quote, among secular elements for whom the Bible had been one of the basic pillars of the new Hebrew culture, there is a sense of loss and privation. Is there a way to restore the Bible to the focus of Hebrew culture? Political and legal factors offer a second area of comparison. Rooted in Calvinist Hebraism, 18th century scholars wrote treatises trying to ground the Commonwealth on the Old Testament. The epigraph from John Adams at the beginning of this essay offers an apt condensation of this thinking. American and Israeli founders rejected the notion that God's sacred text should be enshrined as a constitution. Both sets of founders adopted democratic over theocratic systems, although reliance on the Bible leaves theocracy in the lowercase as a lurking presence. The American Declaration of Independence cited nature's God and the Creator, but the Constitution did not. Nevertheless, the specter of clerical power faded slowly. Presbyterian and Congregationalist churches in Connecticut and Massachusetts remained official. Washington considered a well-trained clergy critical to the war effort, and Congress opened its sessions with prayer. Some states tried to impose Sabbath and land laws inspired by the Hebrew Bible, but this proved a minor note. Ultimately, America turned its back on an established church, epitomized by the power to tax citizens for religious purposes. While Americans continue to favor religion, religion has remained non-established, or to use a simpler word, voluntary. The Israeli Scroll of Independence deployed the euphemistic, ambiguous phrase, Rock of Israel, rather than God, in order to placate both Orthodox and secular Zionists, and the Enlightenment era phrase, Book of Books, Sefer HaSfarim, rather than Torah. Nevertheless, David Ben-Gurion's infamous status quo agreement with the leaders of the ultra-Orthodox party effectively established in the church Orthodox Judaism. This status quo agreement, which left non-Jewish minorities in Israel substantially unaffected, except by their own religious authorities, has been a cause of considerable conflict within the Jewish majority, and as a panoply of personal status issues, Jewish identity, conversion, marriage, divorce, burial, continue to pit the Orthodox officialdom who would like to enforce Jewish law against the secular majority. Whereas the constitutional legacy in the United States pointed both ways in favor of free exercise, but against establishment, Israel's failure to adopt a constitution left only basic laws, subject to perpetual renegotiation and the vagaries of coalition politics. An arguably more successful area of enshrining religious values into modernity in Israel may be found in the development of Mishpat Ivri, literally Hebrew justice, functionally the practice of integrating biblical and rabbinic values into matters customarily dealt with by secular systems. Mishpat Ivri has exerted real impact on the Israeli judicial system without threatening its fundamentally modern nature. Laws regarding the delay of payment of wages, limiting imprisonment for debt, bail, and financial maintenance of family and guardianship, to take just a few concrete examples, draw from Jewish law directly. Third, the Bible provided a meta-narrative, a story of stories, and for both nations, the Exodus and the conquest predominated. Within the Hebrew Bible, one could argue that the Exodus from Egypt already functions as a meta-narrative, validating Israel's obligations to God, undergirding Sabbath observance in Deuteronomy 5, explaining the protection due to the resident alien, the ger. In America, Exodus from religious persecution led to a city on a hill, a theme endlessly reinforced by biblical language and biblical passages. As noted, the founders cited Deuteronomy more than Locke, the Bible more than the Enlightenment philosophes altogether. Of course, citation does not equal endorsement. The founders knew that the average colonist would more likely own a Bible or the New England Primer than Locke's second treatise on government. Yet Washington referred to the Bible too often and in too varied a set of contexts to allow one to dismiss this use as mere rhetoric. Stated affirmatively, Washington looked to the Bible as a model for the new republic. Even Thomas Jefferson, unfairly attacked as an atheist in 1800, read Psalms regularly, carried a portable Bible, one of the dozens he owned, and donated generously to the American Bible Society. Jefferson also prepared a New Testament version called The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth, in which he confided the wisest teachings known to humanity resided. And, with Jefferson's customary modesty, he knew exactly which ones they were and how to find them. This famous Bible actually represented Jefferson's third attempt to distill Jesus' teachings following his 1803 syllabus and his 1804 philosophy of Jesus of Nazareth. I can imagine no better evidence than these three attempts to prove the importance of the Bible to a founder generally placed on the heterodox end of the religious spectrum. On the issue of the Bible's importance, the analogy between Jefferson and Ben Gurion with respect to presentism and overconfidence needs little exaggerating. Originally a labor Zionist, Ben Gurion in the 1950s promoted Bible studies, Bible quizzes, and archaeological endeavors to the extent that critics left and right accused him of bibliolatry, of denuding other sources of ideology and cultural wisdom. Ben Gurion's desire to forge a unified state provided an instrumental impetus for this move, but some of it seems to have been, as with Washington, a natural affinity for the rugged, martial, and civic norms of the Hebrew Bible. To the consternation of many Orthodox, Ben Gurion praised the superiority of the Israeli infantrymen as Bible expositors to Rashi and the medieval commentators who, in Ben Gurion's view, were alienated from the land of Israel and a sovereign nation. For Ben Gurion, the medieval relationship of the commentators to the Bible was hopelessly abstract. The Midrash, per Ben Gurion, had less to do with exegesis than with the rabbinic sages reading into the Bible their own values and beliefs. Ben Gurion believed Israel's history began in the land and that the descent into Egypt only involved a percentage of the people. Since the descent and the Exodus constituted the central myth of ancient Israel, the reaction to Ben Gurion's statement was predictable. The Orthodox Agudat Israel party introduced a no-confidence vote in Knesset, the Israeli parliament, on May 18, 1960, a tribute to the status of the Book of Books and the proverbial bookishness of Jews. Both American and Israeli biblicism have their contemporary critics. Another commonality. The descendants of Jonathan Edwards found the notion of America as the New Jerusalem near blasphemous, and enslaved blacks found this American self-image a bitter, ironic, and unredeemed promise. But the meta-narrative of America as the new Israel with unlimited vistas, think of the artists of the Hudson River School, or the Israeli narrative of restored Israel as sovereign and native, operated powerfully. America had its literal icons, Franklin, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, but traditionally anti-idolatrous Jewish culture got over itself to portray winning generals and political leaders, and even Hebraists, on stamps, currency, and billboards, all in violation of the Second Commandment. In case anyone. Just saying. Naturally, national stories need heroes and villains. If young John Adams imagined himself as the Moses to the English Pharaoh, he ultimately recognized that a different George had been destined for that role. David Ben Gurion, for his part, identified more strongly with Joshua, who did the actual conquering, than with Moses. On one occasion, Ben Gurion committed the terrible faux pas of pronouncing Joshua greater than Moses. I'm aware to Palestinian Arabs, Ben Gurion's self-identification with Joshua, the conquest of Canaan, and the Bible appear as an attempt to erase Palestinian history. That issue seems to me best left to experts in the field of contemporary Arab-Israeli relations. Fourth, and finally, the Bible provided important cultural components to both nations. In America, proclamations of prayer, thanksgiving, and public fasts were common under the Washington and Adams administrations. Even at the national level, Congress hired a chaplain to inaugurate sessions. Prayers were composed and read for a wide variety of public occasions. God was invoked frequently and in a wide variety of public settings, federal, state, and local. The role of colonial revolutionary and early Republican clergy had been understudied until Robert Byrd's Sacred Scripture, Sacred War. Byrd demonstrates the enormous reach of the clergy, primarily versus sermons, often orally delivered or printed subsequently in pulpits, on the battlefields, and on state house lawns. Individual states continue to engage in biblical behaviors unimpeded long after the Bill of Rights, and in fact, well after the adoption of the 14th Amendment. Whatever the Establishment Clause ought to allow or disallow, one may reject originalism and still concede that the founders favored religion over irreligion over all. To sum this part up, the American founders were not Orthodox Christians. The Israeli founders were generally not Orthodox Jews. Nevertheless, as a product of early upbringing, formal education, and mature engagement, both groups were soaked in Bible. Whether in the writings of the devout physician Benjamin Rush or Ellis Boudinot, first president of the American Bible Society, or the anonymous author of the Book of Mormon, the biblical idiom proved dominant in early America to a degree that Locke and Montesquieu could only envy. Even Noah Webster's dictionary often grounded American English in its biblical roots. Historian Eran Shalev has called this genre pseudo-biblicism, but I would prefer a less derogatory term, early Republican biblicism. As with the early American Republic, Israeli culture in the first few decades simply cannot be understood without continual reference to the Bible, whether in education, literature, art, drama, or music. Each of these topics has been explored by gifted scholars, but I have yet to read a single book that puts this picture together for the Israeli context. Many studies trace the rise of the cultural Bible from the Jewish Enlightenment to the present, but no one, I think, would deny a special role to the period under consideration here, the founding generation. I'll take just two small examples. In 1953 and 1904, the school curriculum preserved the teaching of the Bible in national secular schools, continuing a pre-state agreement that the Bible would be taught in all Jewish schools, as it is until today. Novels, historical novels, and autobiographies from this period drew heavily on the Bible and the biblical era. Ben Gurion, Moshe Dayan, Avraham Kariv all recollected their lives in neo-biblical or pseudo-biblical terms. In these cultural domains, Bible provided themes, vocabulary, and text. Much as in the colonial and revolutionary America, personal names and place names to be appropriated as a link to the past, and in both settings, a rebellious point of departure, whether from the British colonial heritage or from the Jewish diasporic past. While early America and modern Israel shared some significant elements of biblical self-conception, they did not share all of them. While Christian Hebraism in the Protestant tradition played a distinct role in the colonial period, with Harvard's Judah Monis and Yale's Ezra Stiles being two highly capable academic examples, Hebrew literacy generally lost its importance in America relative to Greek and Latin, and even Greek and Latin would eventually lose their status. And in some quarters of the American Protestant universe, the King James Bible is actually considered preferable to the Hebrew original. I learned this from a student. In Israel, of course, Hebrew experienced a dramatically different fate, becoming a living vernacular, and with quite an effort, the dominant language among Israeli Jews who came from multilingual backgrounds. The peculiar role played in getting to know the land through hiking, surveying with the Bible in hand, archaeology clubs, all this appears to be particularly Israeli and hit its acme in the formative decades. Some of these trends continue, while others, the field of archaeology for instance, has been professionalized to the extent that even the term biblical archaeology has fallen out of fashion. To these principally tactile aspects, there seemed to be no obvious American counterpart. Another significant difference may be found in the distinction between Israeli conceiving of biblical borders, separating states in a multipolar system, and the American conceiving of a boundless frontier, a monocentric world that posits the civilized and the unknown. Many factors feed into this, including the contradictory way Israel's borders were described in the Bible, including the scattershot way borders were drawn up by the colonial powers directly after World War I, and on the other hand, from the peculiarly inviting vastness of the American continent, a doctrine that by the mid-1840s would come to be called manifest destiny. Yet another difference stems from that of imagining ancestors. Metaphors, even biblical ones such as a city on a hill, remain metaphors. Some American writers certainly thought of Native Americans as lineal descendants of the 10 lost tribes, and the Book of Mormon famously has Jesus paying a visit to the New World, but these were minority viewpoints. When the American founders contemplated the Israelite Constitution as a model, they did not think of themselves as lineal descendants. By contrast, through the magic of fictive kinship, invocations of the patriarchs in the prayer book, Israelis, like Jews generally, consider themselves the actual descendants of Israelites. Anyone would predict differences between these two cases, or indeed any two historical situations. That said, reliance on the Bible in the formative decades of both nations seems great. To conclude, some may say I am comparing apples and oranges, but I hope to have demonstrated that one may productively take up Mark Noll's claim as an invitation to consider the roles Scripture may play in nation building, with the United States and Israel as two examples. Some may ask why this inquiry matters, as I have acknowledged that the Bible's authority and malleability drew the attention of these authors overall. I hope to have shown that seeking self-serving rationales hardly exhausted the interest in the Bible. That seems palpably wrong. In other words, the Bible, however construed or misconstrued, however used or abused, mattered deeply to these founders themselves. The public intellectual Yoram Hazony claims that the Bible stands as the Academy's great blind spot. I agree with that point, even as I disagree with his view about the contents of the Hebrew Bible, which, in my opinion, don't contain a coherent political philosophy or constitute an ancient constitution. Lastly, a consideration of the uses to which the Bible has been put, whether in politics or culture, need not be a critique of the biblical legacy nor an apology for it. Some scholars polemicize against interpretations they see as excessively secularist, while other scholars defend understandings that privilege religion and Scripture. Like everybody else, scholars have biases, and we are not always aware of them. But in an attempt to analyze the importance of the Bible, paying attention to what the biblical text says, but even more attention to how it was subsequently employed, seems to me both a possibility and a worthwhile goal. That has been the assumption of this talk, and admittedly, preliminary reflection. Thank you very much.